What's up, Big Bob?
What's up, Ann?
A lot going on today.
Greg Orman. I don't even know how to introduce you. What is your official title?
I don't know that I have an official title. Friend of Big Bob.
How about father?
I am a father. I have 3 kids. Father, husband, businessman. You know.
We're going to get to the business a little later. We are in association with Be the Best You Foundation and Brenda Ring, who's our executive producer, and a special shout out and thanks for making all these good things happen. Greg Orman is our guest today. An extraordinary story. Extraordinary. You have lived the American dream.
I think so. I've certainly been fortunate and have had lots of interesting experiences, and I'm glad to be here with you today.
And he's written a book, too.
I read the book.
Did you really?
Yeah, I read the book.
Yeah, he spent the whole time looking for his name.
It wasn't there.
Not once. Not once. And I got plenty of Orman stories, and I didn't get mentioned in the book. That's all right. What part of your life journey do you think is most interesting?
You know, I think it's hard to evaluate your own journey in terms of how other people will be interested or not interested in it. You know, but my life has really been about phases, right? You know, I started off, I grew up as the second oldest child in a single parent family with 6 kids. And so for much of my early part of my life, that's really what defined me. But as a kid, you know, I spent a lot of time writing business plans. And
what inspired that?
I think part of it was my father owned a furniture store. And so, you know, I got to see him, particularly during the summers, running his own business. And that intrigued me. And obviously, I had a great deal of admiration for my dad and still do. And so, you know, I started writing business plans as a kid. And invariably going to school and other pressures of life prevented me from executing those plans. But then years later, I'd read about someone in Forbes magazine who did the very thing I thought about doing and made a fortune. And I thought to myself, when I graduate from college, I'm going to start the first good business opportunity that I have.
And you went to Princeton, correct?
I did, yeah.
That's amazing. What did you study there? Was it business?
I studied economics. Actually, Princeton doesn't have any professional degrees. So I studied economics at Princeton, got an AB in economics.
I love the story. I love it. Upon graduation, his father says, Greg, why did you graduate number 3 in your class?
What was your reply?
Well, you know, Big Bob likes to make up stories.
Well, ask him what he graduated.
This is the way I remember the story.
You know, maybe my father was making things up.
Maybe your father.
I graduated with high honors, but I don't think I was anywhere near number 3.
So he says to his dad, Dad, if you had paid for my college instead of making me pay for my college and having a part-time job, I would have gone to the library more and graduated number 1.
Well, again, it was a great experience. I was happy to be able to do it.
But he's blushing.
Yeah. But you know, I did start that first business idea I had. My father, again, owned a furniture store, and somebody came to him and wanted to put an energy-efficient lighting system in, and he sent me the proposal. At the time, I was working for a management consulting firm, and I had spent 3 weeks on an industrial marketing client, which, you know, of course, made me an expert at industrial marketing.
Maybe you could have gotten a job in Europe working for a utility company
or something like that. But
China or something.
Right. So I ended up looking at it and saying, you know, gee, why wouldn't you do this? It was better quality of light, significantly less expensive. You could pay for it out of the savings. I said, you'd have to be stupid not to do it. And then I thought to myself, if he's stupid not to do it, I'd be stupid not to try to sell this product. So I called up the manufacturer of the product and gave him some song and dance about all the relationships I had in Minnesota and how I wanted to represent their product in Minnesota. And he gave me a song and dance about how their product had no competition and
how much money you're going to make.
Yeah, and had I known in the beginning what I learned over the first 9 months, I never would have started that business. But you get into it and you have to make it work.
Right.
And I had good partners, and ultimately we figured out some of the flaws and how we were going to market. And once we got that figured out, there was really no looking back. And the company was highly successful, grew to 5 different markets. We opened up offices in Kansas City, Pittsburgh, Atlanta, and Dallas, and then ended up selling the company, or 70% of it, to Kansas City Power and Light.
Really?
Impressive.
So you sold 70% to Kansas City Power Light. What did you do afterwards?
Well, they asked me to come and run their unregulated energy services business, which, sort of was a head turner for some, because at the time I was 27 years old. And
Wow.
I remember having the conversation about selling them the business, and the CFO of Kansas City Power and Light said to me, well, you got to tell me what you think it's worth. And so I went back and I put a model together, and I had a board of directors that I had assembled because I wanted to be accountable to a bunch of smart people. I thought that was what would help our business be successful. And I brought it to one of them, who was a senior executive at a subsidiary of Emerson Electric, and he looked at it and he said, double it.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah. And I said, well, what do you mean
How do
double
you
it?
justify that?
He said, double it. And so I said, okay. And I doubled it, and I brought it to the CFO of Kansas City Power and Light. He looked at the model, and he said, our tax rate's not 38%, it's 40%. So I changed that in the model. And he said, okay, how much do you want to sell? And that was the whole conversation. And
At
so
27.
at 27. And
It gets better. Then you're employed. Now you're working for the unregulated division.
correct.
President.
Actually, at first, the president of the unregulated energy services division, later the president of the entire unregulated division.
And the president of the regulated division retires, and they offer you his job.
Actually, so the actual path there, I was the head of the unregulated energy services business, and we actually did a great.
27 years old.
I know that keeps going through my
Yeah,
mind.
we grew that business pretty dramatically. Actually, over the 6 years that I was at KLT, we grew that business from about 40 million in revenues to just under $1 billion in revenues.
Damn.
And then when I became
You're a
president,
30% owner of this.
no, that was, our company was a portion of that.
Okay.
So I continued to have ownership in it. And actually, I had to sell out of my ownership in 2002, actually, because Kansas City Power and Light was raising money in the capital markets. If you recall back then, there was a power plant that blew up. And so they were in a big dispute with the insurance company. And so in order to finance the business while that dispute was going on, they needed to raise money from the equity markets. And this was right after Enron.
Oh, yeah.
And so Merrill Lynch, who was raising money for Kansas City Power and Light, said, look, we're not willing to take you out while one of your officers, me, has an ownership interest in a subsidiary. Because if you recall, part of the issue with the whole Enron thing was their CFO, a guy named Andy Fastow, had ownership interests in a bunch of these shell companies that Enron used to manufacture earnings.
Hey, I got a question. Put your hands down. Okay?
Okay.
I'm just curious, and backpedal here a bit, but I'm listening to you, and I've read about you, and I've heard some stories, and it's just like it's high energy, it's constant, always on full throttle, it seems your life has been. Did you ever stop in the moment and just think, wow, what have I accomplished here at this
Wait a
age?
second. We're 20 years ago. You haven't heard what he's done in the last 20 years.
I've read
Wait,
about it. Would
no.
you be quiet? I'm asking because I'm just watching.
The
going,
story
this
is only
just-
10% told so
I know,
far.
and it's already exciting. So would you just let me ask?
All right.
I think one of the byproducts of growing up the way I grew up was this constant motivation,
Where did it come from, though?
driven largely from a position of deficit, from a
Okay.
position of not having what I thought I wanted to
Are
have.
all your siblings like this as well?
I have some very accomplished and successful siblings, but I think it was that drove me. I remember when I got the job at McKinsey and Company, which at the time was a good job to have. I graduated in 1991. We were coming out of a recession, and so it was difficult getting a job, and so it was a great job to have. But I remember about 6 weeks into my tenure at McKinsey, on a weekend, not having anything to do. And that really was unsettling for me. Because
anything to do like recreationally or
anything. Because prior to that point in time, a day didn't go by when I wasn't working on something, whether it was school, whether it was having a job. There was, everything was so oriented around surviving that you get to a point where 6 weeks into it, there was no challenge. There was no war to fight. There was no battle. And
what most people don't understand is fear of failure. Fear is the great motivator, one of the greatest motivators in life, whether it's fear of failure, fear of hunger, fear of stimulation, just fear of not getting what you think you need or not accomplishing. You need to work 60, 80 hours a week to know that you're accomplishing something. That's how your motor works. You can't work 20 and say, I've done a decent week's work.
Certainly at the time, I was wired in a way.
Has that changed?
That suggested I always needed to be active, that there always had to be a challenge, a problem to solve. In some senses, it's moderated. Now that I've got 3 kids, the patterns of life slow down a little bit. And it's, I think, a requirement to be a good parent is to have the ability to slow down a little bit and be patient. And that's a challenge. Let's be clear.
I had 3 kids.
Yeah,
so
that's a challenge. But so it certainly has changed. I think back, and it was probably not until definitely my late 20s before I had taken 3 days off in a row, including weekends. I remember going to a really good friend's wedding in Hawaii, and I landed on Friday morning, and I was back on the plane on Sunday.
Probably saying,
and you missed work.
Yeah,
you're missing.
Yeah.
Geez, I got to get back to work.
Yeah. So I really, for the first 10 years, definitely out of college, it was nonstop working, particularly after that 6th weekend where I realized I didn't have anything to do.
Let's complete the energy story. How did you get out of the energy?
Well, so after that capital raise in November of 2002, the CEO of Kansas City Power and Light at the time, actually it was Great Plains Energy, a guy named Bernie Bowden came to me and said, look, I'm retiring in 18 months, and I'd like to consider you as one of the 2 candidates to potentially replace me.
How old were you?
I was probably 34. They just turned 34.
Publicly held.
Yeah. So
publicly held, probably the biggest, most prestigious employer in Kansas City outside of government.
It certainly was one of the pillars of the Kansas City community. There's no question about it. And the CEOs who held the job prior to that point in time, Bernie Bowden, Drew Jennings, were people who were really active in the community and well respected, well regarded in the community. But when he said that to me, I realized that's not what I aspired to. And in fact, if you think about it at the time, Western Resources was imploding. In fact, David Wittig later got charged with several crimes.
I hope he got out before that.
The CEO. Utilicorp was imploding because they had made some big bets that really aligned with what Enron was doing in the unregulated energy marketplace, and that ended up failing. And it really wasn't, being the CEO of a publicly traded utility company in the Kansas City area wasn't necessarily a path to anything other than trouble and pain, if those 2 were indications. The other thing is the way I was wired. I wasn't wired to be someone who ran a company whose principal skill was figuring out how to persuade regulators to let you make money. Because,
you're an entrepreneur.
Yeah, that's a regulated utility. At the end of the day, it's one of the only industries I know of where you get paid to decorate your office, right? The more you can fit into rate base, the more you can justify increasing energy rates. And up until the time, by the way, that I left in 2002, the prior CEOs had done a great job of keeping a lid on energy costs and doing a really good job of operating those companies as good public stewards. I can't speak for what's happened since then because we've seen electricity rates go up pretty dramatically in the area, but it just wasn't the kind of business where I felt like my skill set was valued. It was a business where you made money by persuading regulators, not by creating products and services that customers wanted.
When he does this, he needs to ask questions.
Ask questions. You got out with a favorable compensation package.
Actually, no, I got out having sold the balance of the company
Right.
that I had sold them. I never, in terms of compensation, my compensation wasn't structured that way.
All right.
So I didn't have a golden parachute. I didn't have any.
You got out with some money.
Yeah, from the businesses that we had created.
You've heard.
prior.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did you do with your money?
From there, I went and started a small private equity firm, and I basically have spent the last 20 years investing in building, turning around, growing companies.
Are there any success stories you want to share that exceeded your expectations from the time you got it to the time you kept it to the time you got out of it?
I've been involved with a lot of businesses that I'm proud of. One of them that was a local Kansas City company is a company called Ringside, which was a former
Everybody's heard of that.
boxing equipment, mixed martial arts equipment company. And at the time we took it over, it was in deep distress. They had gone through a 4-year period of time where they had lost significant amounts of money. The owner at the time had gotten to the point where he couldn't put any more money in, and the banks were circling. And at one point, I got a phone call from his daughter, and I had done some work to try to help give him a path forward, just really on a consulting basis. And she said, Greg, you need to call my dad, because the only time he ever feels good is after he talks to you. And so I called him, and at the time I called him, the banks had sued him to foreclose on the business. They had a hearing coming up where, after having gotten a receiver appointed, they wanted to put chains on the doors and liquidate the business and fire everybody. And I told the owner at the time, I said, look, is the bank going to be in town for the hearing? And he said, yeah, they are. And I said, well, have them come over to my office. And over the course of about 45 minutes, we worked it out so that I took the business over and got him off the hook for his issues. And over the next 7 years, 8 years, we executed what I call the strategy of stabilize, optimize, and grow. We stabilized the business, we stopped the bleeding. We then started to optimize the processes and make sure that we really had things working smoothly, and then we grew it. And the really sort of positive outcome of that business was 2.5 years ago, we sold it to the employees. So
I got questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
You've taken over a lot of businesses, most of them struggling.
Many of them
struggling. Is it a combination of the tools in the toolbox that you already have? You already have all the tools, that you just take out the right tool to fix the business, and it doesn't matter, it's a widget? People are people, sure. Products are products, but is it overall a widget that needs to be fixed?
Generally, most businesses operate very similarly. And what we try to do is control the strategy process,
right?
Where to compete, how to compete, the people process, how do we get and motivate the best people, and the finance process, how do we fund it all?
Right.
And those levers are pretty constant in most businesses, but then every business also has those things that make them unique. And the key is not only applying the toolkit, the key is also figuring out what are the key success factors to this business? What are the levers we need to pull in this business to make it more effective? As an example, one of the companies that I created was called Nationwide Electric. We bought and built a nationwide electrical contractor. And when we did it, we had a very clear performance improvement plan. First 3 things we did were, we got control of purchasing. I told people in that business, if you brought in the donuts in the morning, you got the pipe and wire order in the afternoon, right? So donuts were currency in that industry. And we needed to make it a much more objective process. So purchasing, we had to get right. Working capital management, we had to get right. Most of those businesses were great banks.
Right.
You know, they would pay their bills like clockwork on the 27th, and then they would get paid 90 days later. And so they were basically financing their customers' businesses.
Right.
And so we had to get that dialed in. And then the last thing was job selection. You know, they didn't decide which jobs to take based on economic factors. A great case in point, we had a business in
Not
Minneapolis.
making your margins, don't take it.
Well, we had a business in Minneapolis, and they got the opportunity to do the electrical work at the Minnesota Wilds hockey stadium. Brand new hockey stadium being built.
Right.
Isn't that where you're from?
I am from
Yes.
Minnesota originally. And the CEO came to us and said, look, we want to take this project. You know, we want to do the Minnesota Wild, and the margins were just too low. And so the guy who was running the business at the time said to him, you know, that's just not going to work. You know, we're not going to do that. And he said, well, but we need to do it. It's the Wilds. It's hockey in Minnesota. We need to do it. He said, no, you're not going to do it. Not at those margins.
Right.
And so they passed on the job. And 6 months later, he came to him and he said, you know, it was the best thing we ever did.
The guy who did it was out of business.
Guy who did it can't compete with us.
I've always said, if you're the cheapest bid out there, that means you're the closest one to going out of business.
Yeah, there's some truth to that. No question about it. You know, oftentimes it's the guy who makes the mistake who gets the job.
Right.
And, you know, it's my theory in real estate as well. If I can't identify the loser, it's me. Right. So
that's how I play poker.
Yeah. Right.
Well, I'm sitting over here with a completely different perspective than you. I'm not a business owner, never have been. I have an MBA, but haven't figured out where to put it yet.
I'm very interested in your perspective then.
Well, no, it's not a perspective. It's more like a question, because I've been in a field where I'm a writer. Not a very lucrative field. So I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, if someone else were listening to this, what kind of traits does one need to pursue the type of work that you've done? Like, you seem so energetic and vibrant and enthusiastic. One without fear and hesitation. But what does it take to succeed in your world?
Well, it depends what you define as my world. But if you're talking about what does it take to succeed as an entrepreneur, I tell people it's a passionate desire to be an entrepreneur. You know, I mean, the difference I think between entrepreneurs and business people is the number of decisions that get made and the sheer velocity. You know, entrepreneurs tend to make more decisions, maybe sometimes shooting from the hip, but they tend to make more decisions.
You don't shoot from the hip, do you?
They move faster. I always had the benefit of having a really good partner, a guy named Mark Schrader, who worked with me in many of my early businesses. And I used to say I'd make 10 times as many decisions as most people. And Mark would tell me when I was wrong.
What do you think a lot of this?
And that's what you need, is someone who's going to tell you when you're wrong so that you can fix the decisions.
Yeah, but I don't know what I'm talking about.
So you can fix the faulty decisions. And that's that partnership really, I would have accomplished substantially less if it weren't for people like Mark in my life who really helped me make good decisions.
Well, do you think people like to be entrepreneurs? They have great business ideas, whether small or big. And do you think somebody comes by it naturally, or do you think they should just dive all in and go for it?
You know, I think there are certain attributes, personal attributes, that can help you be successful in starting and running a business. You know, part of it is just that willingness to take a risk, because so often, that's part of it. And look at my first business. I mean, the business plan that we started off with did not work. So you had to course correct. You had to make a midstream change, and you have to be willing to do that. Acknowledge when you've made a mistake, and then make a better decision in the future.
Does the fake it till you make it philosophy ever apply?
I mean, you know, look in the sense that do you lie about your capabilities?
Not lying it, but
no.
I mean, maybe presented with something where you'll say yes and figure it out later.
I think everybody to a certain extent has a little bit of an imposter's complex when it comes to, you know, getting started, and you've got to do what you think are the right things to do. And sometimes you're wrong, right? But I don't know that I would necessarily ascribe to people fake it till you make it. I think that's a recipe for financial fraud.
I didn't mean it in that.
Yeah, I understand.
Fake it till you make it is just keep pushing forward without a plan and not knowing where you're going to go, but you know you're eventually going to get someplace, and you're okay with that. When you say fake it till you make it, that's what it means to me.
Yeah.
And I don't think this man has ever faked it till. I think he's had a plan, before
Since
he's
he was a kid.
before he took a step forward, he knew the direction he was stepping.
Yeah, was it Eisenhower said, fail to plan to fail.
Right.
And so I think there is truth to that. The key here, though, is invariably you've got to be willing to change your perspective as new information presents itself. And, I wrote a book you mentioned earlier called The Declaration of Independence. There was one chapter I left out of the book.
The one about me?
The one about
Quit
you.
that.
No.
That'd be a very short chapter.
The chapter I left out of the book was a chapter that basically described how my business experience informed my views of politics. And, I talked a lot about areas where government can learn from the private sector. And when I say that, most people immediately go to ideas like efficiency and accountability. And yeah, by almost every measure, the private sector is more efficient than the public sector, more accountable. In fact, there are some agencies of the federal government where you are more likely to die than you are to get fired. So yeah, there's limited accountability in the federal government. But the area I really think the government can learn from the private sector is how they solve problems in an environment of conflict. And, if you think about it, many companies are set up in environments that have conflict. American Express, a great example. If you're the head of marketing for American Express, you want everybody to qualify for an American Express card.
Right.
Because your goals are based on card member growth.
Right.
If you're the chief financial officer, you don't even want Warren Buffett to qualify because your goals are in part based on bad debt expense. And so you have this environment of conflict, but somehow in the private sector, they're able to work those conflicts out and ultimately get to a point where they make better decisions, their businesses grow, they create jobs and opportunities for people. And a big part of that, the thing that you've got to do right in the private sector that doesn't get done right in the public sector is you've got to acknowledge when you're wrong. Okay, you've got to embrace facts, acknowledge when you've made a mistake, and course correct. And I think that flexibility, that willingness to not just plan, but also acknowledge when the information you're receiving is inconsistent with your plan, you've got to be willing to change course. And by the way, private sector people have a hard time with this as well. I do this, when I take over a company, oftentimes there's a 6-month period of time that goes fine, but there's a lot of give and take and pushback with the management team. And eventually the CEO will come to me and will say something like, Greg, why don't you believe in us? Because there's so much pushback. And I said, it's not that I don't believe in you. It's that once you've made up your mind, most people stop looking for information that they're wrong. They've got this deep confirmation bias.
True.
They only look for information they're right. And I said, I'll give you an example. Let's do an experiment here. I'm going to give you a series of 3 numbers, and they're all governed by a rule. And your goal is to guess what the rule is with as few guesses as possible. But if you want more information, you can give me another series of 3 numbers, and I'll tell you if they're governed by the same rule. So I'll give them a series of 3 numbers, 20, 22, 24, and they'll immediately say up by 2. And I'll say, no, that's not the rule. And then they'll think about it for a minute and they'll say 2, 4, 6. And I'll say, yep, that's governed by the same rule. And they'll say consecutive even numbers. And I'll say, no, that's not the rule. And we'll go through this process. The rule is just the second number has to be bigger than the first and the third has to be bigger than the second. So it has to be in ascending order. But I remind them, I say, let's go back to the process we just went through. If you thought it was consecutive even numbers, why did you say 2, 4, 6 to me? Why didn't you say 1, 2, 3? Because I would have said that's governed by the same rule and you would have known that you were wrong. You didn't look for evidence that you were wrong. You only look for evidence that you were right.
Affirmation.
And so that's the challenge. And that's what, I think one of the key factors for most people and most businesses being successful is the ability to take a look at facts as they've come in, particularly facts that contradict your point of view or your strategy or your plan, and the willingness to acknowledge when you're wrong and change course.
That would be hard for you to acknowledge you're wrong, wouldn't it be?
No. What would be hard for me is having someone to explain to me in elementary terms these advanced concepts. And he's trying to dummy it down for us, and it's difficult for him to dummy it down for us so we understand it.
Well, I'm thinking
hold
too.
on.
Okay, go ahead.
No.
Okay.
Business is not your passion, is it?
No, not really.
Right. Third party. I have found that to be by far the most interesting chapter of your life. Besides the childhood, the striving to be successful, climbing, putting a ladder against all the right walls, climbing to the top of the ladders, climbing to the different tops of all the mountains. I think that was recreation for you. I think your passion was leadership through politics.
Yeah, you say third party, and I guess a couple of points. One is my basic belief is the two-party system is irreparably broken. They're
Everybody agrees.
They're not interested in solving the right problem. The right problem is, how do I improve the lives of the American people? They're interested in solving the problem of, how do I get reelected?
Right.
And in fact, they're not interested in seeing our country succeed so much as they want to see the other party fail. And that's what defines our politics today, is this desire to see the other party fail. And unfortunately, when politics is practiced that way, the real loser is the American people. We just stop solving problems. And there's so many problems that we need to solve. And there are solutions to those problems, but it doesn't work, and we won't find a pathway to those solutions if our mode of conveyance is a Democratic donkey or a Republican elephant. I think we need an independent life raft. And that's what I've spent a lot of my life working on. If you go back to...
Hold on a second.
Yes, we'll be editing. How did you meet? We need to know how you guys met.
We just met today.
Yeah, well, we'll go through that. But if I go back, I told this story when I last ran for office.
What offices did you run for?
I've run for the U.S. Senate, and I've run for governor of Kansas. But when I ran for governor of Kansas, I told people that I came by my interest in politics. Honestly, my maternal grandfather was Hubert Humphrey's top aide for 25 years. My mother, as you might imagine, because of that, was a Democrat. She was a member of the nurses union. And very much lockstep with her father and her family in the Democratic Party.
Humphrey would be a Republican today.
Who knows? On the flip side, my father was a small business owner,
Republican
and
tendencies.
believed in limited government, and so he was very much a Republican. And I remember being at Boys Nation as a 17-year-old, getting to meet Ronald Reagan in the Rose Garden, coming home and telling my dad.
Wasn't he your favorite president?
He was certainly a president that I admired. Coming home and telling my dad, that I might want to be a politician someday, and he said, without skipping a beat, maybe you should skip the internship and go straight into crime. So, my dad's perspective was that politicians were all a bunch of criminals. Now, today, I think if you look at what people think and how they view politicians, most of them view, if not politicians, certainly the system itself as being deeply corrupt. And I think there's all sorts of evidence that they're right in that regard. And so my goal is to change the political system to create a real third force in our politics, so that we can get our country back into the business of solving problems and improving the lives of the American people. That's what it's about. And if I take it all the way back,
right.
If I go all the way back, after that Boys Nation experience, I sort of had it in my head that I might want to be a politician, but I didn't really understand what that meant, right? We were doing policy stuff. I got to meet Ronald Reagan at the White House. It was really pretty heady, but it wasn't what politics was really about. It wasn't until 2 years later, my first trip to New York City. So it would have been 1988. And this is, New York City, back when things were pretty rough, right? Lots of graffiti.
88. How old were you then? 19?
I was 19. And I remember getting on a subway, and I saw a father get on the subway with his two daughters, and they were probably, 4 and 6 years old, and they were sort of clutching their dad's thighs.
Scared shitless.
Well, I looked at them, and the girls looked like they felt like they were safe. They were with dad, right? I looked in his eyes, and he felt anything but safe. He was scared. And I thought to myself right then and there, if I could do anything with my life, if I could give this man a sense of security, and not just physical security that he can hold down a job, that if he gets sick, he's not going to have to file for bankruptcy, that he belongs, that his children can have
Right.
productive and safe lives, then I would really be making a contribution. And that for me is really what was the guiding sort of light of why I wanted to be involved in public service, was to improve that man's life. And, as I think about it, I've had lots of choices I could make during the course of my political endeavors. In fact, at one point, after the Senate race in 2014, Bob Dole had sent a lot of smoke signals that he wanted to meet.
My hero.
I heard from 3 separate people in the span of a week that Senator Dole wanted to get together.
And you ran as an
independent against a longtime friend of his.
Right.
In fact, Senator Dole marshaled a lot of resources against me. But I made an appointment with his office. I came and saw him on St. Patrick's Day in 2015. And after all the pleasantries, he said to me, Greg, if you'd have just said you were going to be a Republican, you'd be in the Senate right now.
I had a relationship with him.
Well, it sounds like a subject for another podcast.
Yeah, not that type.
Maybe a different
that type, not that type.
Different type. So he said you would have been in the Senate right now, and I knew that was true. In fact, a lot of people had counseled me that, but I asked him the same question I asked them, which was, would I be making a difference? Would I be accomplishing anything? And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, no, you wouldn't. And I thought, I'd rather play golf. And I had to make the same decision in 2018. I could have run as a Democrat, likely gotten the Democratic nomination, and then ultimately been elected. But to do it, I would have had to abandon my belief that this 2-party system was deeply dysfunctional. It would be something that I would do for personal benefit, but without sort of hewing towards that core belief, which is really that we need a third force in our politics if we want to improve the lives of the American people.
Is the third party still called Common Sense Coalition?
No, I had an organization that I started back in 2010 called the Common Sense Coalition. We grew that a little bit. I've since merged that into an organization called Unite America. But no, there isn't a third party effort right now that I'm affiliated with.
Okay.
I'm really talking about a third force. It doesn't need to be a party.
Look, all it needs to be is 6 or 10 people in the Senate.
Yes, and
16 people in the House, and you can make a difference. It's not that it doesn't have to be a third.
We talked about it in 2014. The reason I ran in 2014 was one of my co-founders at the Common Sense Coalition and I decided, after a couple of years of working on that we had understood a couple of truths. One was the problem with independents are they're independent.
Right.
They don't work together. So there are a lot of political reform efforts going on, but no one really sharing resources, no one working together and leveraging that. And the second thing was that if you wanted to change policy outcomes, you had to change electoral outcomes. Elected officials don't care about anything except getting reelected. And so that's
term limits.
That's where you had to deal with it. And so we came up along with a couple of other folks with this idea of the Senate fulcrum strategy. This idea if we could get enough people elected to the U.S. Senate as independents that neither party would have a majority, we could control a lot. And so we did polling in 17 states. We found 7 states where an independent, we believe, could run and win. We couldn't recruit a single candidate. No one wanted to run. They were all concerned about what will my friends think? How will I raise money without a party?
Wait, we're talking about making a difference in the United States of America.
Yeah.
They're putting a label on it.
Yeah, and
they're putting greed and ego ahead of public service.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's what a lot of our current public servants do.
Well,
Look
at the headlines.
Yeah. So anyway, in June of 2014, 6 months before the election, actually 5.5 months before the election, I finally decided if you believe in this enough, you've got to suit up and do it.
Right.
3 months later, we were leading in the polls. And so it was a pretty remarkable run. It was frankly, it was a real gratifying to be able to travel the state, talk to people about issues they cared about, et cetera. Now back to the issue they really care about. How did we?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. You seem like such a big fan, and I know when we first met, you frequently spoke highly of him.
Oh, Mr. Orman has the second highest IQ probably of anybody I've ever met. And the only person I've ever met who I think IQ is higher is his father. Right? He doesn't use it as well as you do, but he is.
You might want to edit that part out.
Right? His father, Tim, is my best friend. And so I met Greg probably when he was 13 years old, sweeping the floors at his dad's furniture store.
Yeah.
And I've had an opportunity to periodically glance in and watch you grow up and become the intelligent, articulate, thoughtful gentleman you've become.
Well, it's nice of you to say. Yeah, we go way back, and I've spent many nights sleeping on Dave's sofa. And when I was down here working either in my dad's store or just visiting, we've spent many meals together. Dave's been a great supporter of mine throughout, particularly the political stuff.
First check.
The first check, I gave Dave the honor both times of writing the first check to my campaign. So
thank you.
And he was
Thank you.
He was gracious and willing to do that.
One
Could have had another zero on it, but
one time you wrote the check and said, just sign here.
Yeah, right.
Well, now I'm curious too, because you've opened up this great page-turning book that you've written, but there's still several more chapters, clearly. What does the future hold for
I
you?
want to know, what are you going to do with this political thing? Will you make a difference? Are you going to be a spectator or participant? Are you going to be the puppet master, encouraging other people to take the frontline bullets? What are you going to do?
Look, and since I first ran for office, I've gone from having no children to having 3 children, and so that does change the equation a little bit, and it's important, I think, that I be present for my children's lives, and so I'm certainly trying to do that. Look, I continue to support candidates, independent candidates, where I think they can have an impact, even if I don't think they're going to win. I continue to work with a number of political reform organizations that are focusing on changing the incentives that our elected officials operate under so they do a better job of governing and solving problems. I'm not persuaded that work is going to have an impact fast enough to really address some of our problems, but I'm also, again, willing to acknowledge and have a little humility about whether or not I'm right. And so I'm gonna work towards it, even if I'm not sure that it's going to have the kind of outcome I hope it has. And I've started another little organization that's just starting off called We Deserve Better.
I love it.
That's focused on a 6-pack of reforms that I think are reforms more consistent with the ones that you're looking for, like term limits, like a lifetime ban on lobbying for members of Congress, like banning lobbyists from giving money to congressional candidates.
It's funny. I knew you had a Democratic background, a liberal background. And since the time I was 10 years old, my parents were very liberal. I was handing out brochures for Nixon against Kennedy. I mean, I've had a conservative slant, right? But when we talked about politics, and it was the common sense coalition, I found everything you said I could align to and sign off to. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, sign me up. Even though we came from different ideology backgrounds, the middle ground made the most sense. And the middle ground should have had the most traction and should have been easy to sell. But what you said when we started this section was the Republicans are trying to make the Democrats fail, and the Democrats are trying to push the Republicans off the cliff into failure. And there will be no middle ground because they don't want to work together. They want to get reelected and divide the American people. And that is what has to be fixed.
Well, so, and they're in a little bit of a box. I tell people that the Republican and Democratic brands are the 2 worst consumer brands in the world.
Right.
For one really simple reason. They're defined almost exclusively by negative advertising. I mean, think about it. If Coke and Pepsi did that, Coke said Pepsi made you 3 inches shorter. Pepsi said Coke makes your hair fall out, right? Would anybody drink Coke or Pepsi?
No,
No,
not at
we
all.
drink water, beer, wine, juice.
Maybe
7-Up,
Bud-
anything but Coke or Pepsi.
Maybe Bud Light.
Yeah, well, anything but Coke or Pepsi. The fact of the matter is, the reason it works in politics is because we have only two choices. And because we have only two choices, their goal is not to figure out how to present a positive image of themselves, how to be aspirational in terms of what they want to achieve for the American people. Their goal is simple. It's to make you hate and fear their opponent. And
Aren't there enough like-minded people? Aren't there enough like-minded people who have big checkbooks who want to fix it?
Again, I don't know that there are. I think there are many, and it's a growing number of people who are finally recognizing that the system of government is failing us. But there are also a lot of them who are invested in the fight between the left and the right. And, they will continue to be invested in that. The United States, they've done an analysis of there are 8 large liberal democracies like the United States dominated by a two-party system. In those 8 large liberal democracies dominated by a two-party system, voter alienation in the United States with your own party is far higher than in any of those other ones. Voters no longer like their own party. Many people are Democrats because they hate the Republicans, or they're Republicans because they hate the Democrats, or they're a Republican-leaning independent because they hate the Democrats, and vice versa. And that alienation doesn't provide lots of pathways for candidates. We saw it in our race in 2014. Pat Roberts was at a 40% positive approval rating and about a 54% negative. There was no resurrecting him. The only way he could win that election is to do what he did, which is pour ungodly sums of money into the market to tell people how bad I was. And, so that's the nature of our politics today. And that's the dynamic that will continue to exist as long as we have two parties.
You're at a loss for words.
No. This is probably one of the most serious conversations you can have. We have no control over God. We have no control over this. We might have a control, voice, vote over our government. But I believe the Warren Buffetts, the Musk, this Bloomberg, the people who have the tremendous amount of money put it together and say, let's drive it right down the middle and save our country. Fuck my wealth. Screw my wealth. Screw.
Not the first time that's happened on this, is it? No.
Forget about my legacy, my money. I'd rather spend my wealth fixing the country. And here's $20 billion. Let's develop a third party to fix the country. Do away with term limits. Fix this problem. They're all common sense solutions, except the parties won't work together. There needs to be somebody getting in between to make it happen.
Yeah. Look, the more resources that we have towards building a third force, all things being equal, the better. And would it be great to have some of those folks get involved in a constructive way? Sure. At the end of the day, this is about the American people.
Yeah, they get right. They only get one. Musk only gets one vote.
This is about the American people standing up and saying, we deserve better. We deserve better than two parties who care more about their own futures than they do about the future of the American people. We deserve better.
Hallelujah, pass the peace, amen.
Right. But that's what we have to do. We need to appeal to the American people. We need to appeal to them not only intellectually, but also emotionally. Most of the people that I've met love this country. Most of the people, the thousands of people that I've met campaigning, want this country to work. They're not invested as much as the politicians are in this fight between left and right. They want their kids to grow up happy and safe communities.
Exactly.
They want to be financially secure in their homes, their health, their retirement. That's what they want. And unfortunately, those people who have something to gain from changing the status quo oftentimes aren't as intensely interested as the people who have something to lose. And so we've got to get them more invested. We've got to get them more active. You know, Olympia Snowe, a senator from Maine, when she gave her farewell address to the Senate, said that she recognized that change really needed to come to Washington, D.C., but it was not going to come from within inside Washington, D.C. It was going to come from outside of it. And in my mind, yes, those resources can be helpful, maybe even catalytic, but at the end of the day, we need to appeal to the American people to step back up, to suit up, and to reclaim their sovereignty. And that's really what this is about.
Mr. Orman, I have listened to many politicians. I've listened to many speaking heads, talking heads on both sides of the equation. I have never heard anybody as articulate, as informed, as smooth communication skills as what you have. You are doing yourself and our country a tremendous disservice by not being in front of millions and millions of people with your message.
Did they bring me here to lecture me?
Yes.
Yeah, right. That's what
Yes.
he's good at.
You can help fix the problem, but you got to do something about it, because millions of people have to hear what we just heard, plus more and more and more, a weekly podcast, a weekly show, because you can fix America. You can be the switch that turns everything around, and you got 20, 30 years to do it.
Well, and you know, again, I appreciate you saying that, and I'm going to continue to work on it. And I have 3 really, really, really important
Good reasons.
reasons to
Beautiful
work on
children.
it, right?
Right.
Because I want them to grow up in a country that affords them the same opportunities that it afforded me. You know, we may be the first generation of Americans to fail to leave a better nation for future generations.
It's funny you should say that, and I'm going to interject here because I want to, because this is the part I'm interested in, because there's probably a lot of people just like myself who maybe be afraid to speak up, or they feel like that but just don't know where to go, where to start. Because I have these conversations with my husband nearly every evening, and I even once said,
You're still married?
yes, we're still married. I said, screw it, because we both have the same mindset.
Sure.
So we just thinking like you, and it's like, screw it, I'm just going to run for president, get out of the way of Joe Biden, I'm on my way. That was one night when we were really getting intense about where this country's going. I'm like, I'm just going to run for president then if I want to see a change.
I don't know if I'd vote for you.
Anyway. I know, hey, but what I'm saying is if somebody feels that passionate about where this country is.
You need an intellectual. I mean, that's the difference. This man is intellectual powerhouse. He is.
My question was.
He is an intellectual property.
Enough.
No, seriously. You need to share it with the American people.
How do people get involved that have the same passion as you?
Yeah.
Perhaps not the same vehicle to get the message.
Well, and again, that's part of why I'm in the process of creating this We Deserve Better organization, because there are, I'm hoping, millions of Americans like you who recognize that what we're doing isn't working. They want a different path and they want to be a part of it.
Right.
You know, I look back and Dave and I have had this conversation before. So if it's redundant to you, I apologize. But, you know, not long ago, really, we've started to see the last of the greatest generation pass away. Right. You know, and these were people who, during World War II, when we were facing totalitarianism across the globe, you know, they became soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. They fought fascism in North Africa and Europe and the Pacific. Millions more rushed into factories to support the war effort. You know, they did everything from sacrifice on the food they ate to plant victory gardens, buy war bonds, the whole thing. We call them our greatest generation. They're genuine heroes, right? We need another generation of American heroes. We need another generation.
Will you run again for something?
You know, if enough people ultimately end up suiting up alongside of me so that we can have an impact, I'd be open to it.
Do you want my number?
No.
I know how to reach it.
I want to be involved. Only because, not because I love you, respect you, and think that I think you can make a difference. And I don't know if I've ever met anybody in my lifetime that can make a difference before. You're the one who can.
And bearing that in mind, Obviously, there's so much more to talk about. What would it take to get you back on this show to continue this dialogue? Because we've just begun the excitement with you.
A text message.
A text
I love you,
message.
brother.
Good to be with you.
Greg Orman.
Nice to meet
Nice
you.
to meet you.
Bye.
Big Bob.
And I'm Ann.
What's up?